The studio lights in the Los Angeles debate hall were blazing, unforgiving, relentless, bright enough to turn the entire stage into a furnace. Most candidates shifted under that intensity, their collars tightening, their confidence thinning. But Karoline Levitt stood at center stage as though the heat rolled right off her. She touched the small silver cross pinned to her blazer, lifted her chin, and faced the cameras with the poise of someone who had already survived fire much hotter than this. She knew exactly what was coming. She had seen it in every rehearsal clip of her opponent, and in every moment he felt cornered, the instant Gavin Newsom started losing an argument. He pivoted to personal attacks. Tonight, judging by the strain around his smile and the restless energy in his posture, he was losing badly. The moderator opened the next segment, State Failures, and the audience leaned forward as though bracing for impact. Homelessness numbers, drug overdose deaths, the quiet but steady departure of middle-class families who could no longer afford to live in the state they grew up in. These were topics Newsom hated addressing, topics that left him exposed. So he did what he always did. He deflected. He angled his body toward Karoline, smoothed his expression into a practiced smirk, and delivered a line that had clearly been polished backstage. "Karoline," he said, voice heavy with condescension, "people like you are brainwashed. You don't understand real governance. You just repeat talking points." The room froze. Even the moderator hesitated, unsure if she should interfere. Cameras zoomed in, splitting screens between Newsom's smug grin and Karoline's still unreadable face. Many expected her to flinch, to stumble, to show even the smallest crack. She didn't move. Inside her chest, she felt the familiar flicker, the moment she lived for, the precise instant her opponent crossed a line so boldly, so publicly, that all she had to do was respond correctly and the tide would shift entirely in her favor. Newsom, misreading her silence as intimidation, pressed harder. "You talk about California like you understand it." He continued, gesturing broadly as though presenting evidence. "But you've never run anything. You've never managed a state. You don't know what you're talking about." The audience murmured uneasily. A woman near the front whispered, "Did he really say that?" Still, he pushed. "You're young, you're inexperienced, and you're parroting whatever your party tells you. That's what brainwashing looks like." He chuckled, a soft, dismissive sound that instantly changed the atmosphere. The camera cut back to Karoline. This time she wasn't expressionless. She was smiling, not wide, not triumphant, a small, measured, devastating smile that made the room lean in. She stepped toward her microphone, her heels striking the stage in deliberate, echoing taps. Each step sounded like punctuation. "Well," she said quietly, so quietly the crowd stilled to hear her, "if you're done insulting millions of Americans who think differently than you, Governor, I'd like to respond." Newsom crossed his arms, amused, as though he believed he still controlled the narrative. Karoline lifted her gaze and locked eyes with him, her expression sharp, steady, surgical. "What you call brainwashed," she said, "most people call awake." The audience erupted. Cheers, whistles, applause, wave after wave of noise that rolled over the stage. Newsom's smile faltered, just slightly, but enough for the cameras to catch. The moderator raised her hands, trying to quiet the room, but momentum was already shifting, and Karoline wasn't done. "Every time you're confronted with your failures," she continued, her voice rising over the crowd, "you attack the person holding the mirror instead of the reflection you created. That's not leadership, that's fear." The noise grew louder, more electric. Newsom swallowed, his confidence draining. Karoline leaned closer to the mic, "And if defending families' faith and freedom makes me brainwashed," she paused, "then America must be full of geniuses. Because they agree with me, not with you?" The hall exploded. People stood. Some cheered so loudly their voices cracked. Newsom closed his eyes for a brief, pained moment, as if realizing he had just lost control of the narrative, and possibly the night. But the debate wasn't over. When the moderator moved to the next question, Newsom tried to recover, leaning toward his microphone before she finished speaking. "You're too young to understand real policy, Karoline," he said, the words sharp enough to slice through the rising applause. "You've been politically brainwashed." Gasps rippled through the audience. Karoline didn't flinch. She blinked once slowly, almost amused as though he were performing exactly as she had predicted. He continued, doubling down. "I've met interns with more independent thought. You just repeat whatever your side tells you. That's not leadership. It's obedience." The room bristled with tension. Some people shifted, some whispered, some stared open-mouthed. But Karoline remained perfectly still, perfectly calm, perfectly ready. And Gavin Newsom, for the first time that evening, looked like a man who had walked himself into the very trap he thought he was setting. Even the production crew exchanged uneasy glances behind the cameras. This wasn't spirited political sparring anymore. This was personal, sharp, reckless. A strike meant to bruise rather than debate. The energy shifted so abruptly that even the moderator hesitated, her cue cards dipping slightly as if she sensed the moment slipping out of her control. Karoline finally turned her head toward Governor Gavin Newsom. She moved slowly, deliberately, with the steady calm of someone preparing not for argument, but for dissection. Her face was composed, unreadable, almost serene. Everyone watching, from the front row to the control room, knew the question on the moderator's card no longer mattered. The night had pivoted. The spotlight belonged entirely to the two of them. Newsom folded his arms across his chest, convinced he'd delivered a decisive blow. A belittling strike, the kind meant to rattle a younger opponent into retreat. But he didn't know Karoline. She didn't wilt, she didn't bristle. She didn't even blink. Instead, she offered a tight, dangerous smile, the kind that told the entire audience she wasn't cornered. She was preparing to turn the room. For anyone who knew her, this moment was familiar. Karoline Levitt didn't crumble. She calculated. Every insult, every attempt to diminish her, became fuel she knew how to weaponize. And tonight, under the heat of the studio lights, that calculation was already taking shape. The cameras shifted, tightening their focus. Audience members leaned forward instinctively. Even the producers behind the glass, normally buried in screens and signals, had gone utterly still. Something electric was happening, something unpredictable and live. Across from her, Newsom reclined casually in his chair, smirk polished to perfection. One hand draped over the armrest like a monarch surveying subjects. He believed he'd framed her as naive, unthinking, brainwashed, as he'd said. A tactic he had honed over years: belittle, dismiss, then smile while the opponent crumbled under the scrutiny. But this time, he'd gravely misread the room, and the woman sitting across from him. Karoline didn't deflect. She didn't laugh awkwardly to smooth the tension. She didn't lower her gaze or search for talking points. Instead, she straightened her posture with subtle confidence. The pen she'd been holding clicked softly as she set it down. The small silver cross around her neck caught the light in a way that felt symbolic, quiet, steady, unshakable. Someone near the cameras whispered, "She's about to swing." "You know what's funny, Governor?" she said at last, her voice impossibly calm, each word placed with surgical precision. "People only use the word brainwashed when they're out of facts." A ripple moved through the audience, gasps, murmurs, a low whistle from the back row. Newsom blinked once, a small involuntary flicker that betrayed the first crack in his polished armor. Karoline continued, her tone firm but controlled, like a prosecutor laying out a case piece by piece. Pointing out California's highest in the nation homelessness rate is brainwashed. She said, "Then I suppose statistics brainwashed me." Another ripple. "I've noticing that your tax policies drove businesses out of the state is brainwashed. Then maybe math brainwashed me." A louder reaction. Now the audience was responding to every sentence. And if believing that parents, not the government, should have a say in their children's education is brainwashed, she paused and let silence stretch just long enough. Then half the country must be brainwashed too. The room erupted. Applause burst through the hall. Someone shouted, "Exactly!" A woman in the third row stood up with her hand raised like she was praising a sermon. The moderator glanced helplessly toward the control booth, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment breathe and go viral. Newsom's smile thinned. He tried to cut in. "That?" Karoline stepped over him with flawless timing. "What I won't accept," she said, leaning forward just slightly, "is a governor who presides over failing cities and rising crime levels telling me that I'm the one incapable of critical thought." The crowd roared again, louder than before. Even the moderator's eyebrows shot upward in genuine surprise. For the first time all night, Newsom's confidence faltered. His shoulders tensed. His smirk wavered. The shift in power was unmistakable. Viewers at home would feel it. Analysts would replay it. Clips would circulate before the commercial break even aired. Karoline inhaled once, steady and deliberate, and delivered the line that sealed the moment. "Governor," she said, "if truth sounds like brainwashing to you, maybe that says more about you than it does about me." Silence, thick, cinematic, absolute, fell over the studio. Even the cameras seemed to freeze. The moderator finally whispered, "We'll be right back." But everyone in the room knew the direction of the debate had changed. The control had slipped, the story had written itself, and Newsom, once the dominant voice on stage, had lost the room. A sudden shift rippled through the audience, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Heads tilted, posture stiffened. Even the camera operators, usually unfazed by on-air tension, paused with their fingers hovering over controls. And at the center of it all, Gavin Newsom blinked, visibly startled. For the first time that evening, the confident grin slipped. Karoline didn't pull back. She leaned in, closing the distance between her words and his silence. "You call me brainwashed because I don't bow to your narrative," she said, her voice steady, cool, lethal. "But let's be honest. You spent years convincing Californians that your failures are accomplishments. You call that leadership. I call that delusion." The room erupted, gasps, laughter whispers firing across the hall like sparks. Cameras zoomed tighter. Newsom inhaled sharply, as though preparing a rebuttal, but nothing emerged. He hadn't expected precision, not like this. The moderator lifted a hand, trying to regain control, but the moment had already slipped away. It belonged to Karoline now. "You attacked my intelligence because you couldn't attack my facts," she continued. "You tried to embarrass me because you couldn't answer me. That's not a debate, Governor. That's insecurity with a hair gel budget." The crowd broke. Real, unfiltered laughter rolled across the stage. Even some of Newsom's aides behind the cameras sank into their seats. Newsom's jaw tightened, the polished composure cracking around the edges. "And one more thing," Karoline added, her tone softening in a way that only sharpened the blow. "If standing up for the truth makes me brainwashed, then what does ignoring reality make you?" Silence fell thick, crushing, unforgettable. The kind of silence destined to live forever in clips, reaction videos, and headlines. The kind of silence that ends careers or launches new ones. Newsom didn't answer. He couldn't. Karoline sat back, composed and unshaken, while the audience's reaction made something unmistakably clear. She had taken the room away from the governor of California, and he knew it. She stepped forward to the center of the stage, her silhouette outlined by the hot studio lights, which seemed to glow brighter with the rising tension. Newsom stood rigid at his podium, jaw locked tight. The trademark smile was nowhere in sight. Behind him, his team whispered, frantic, unsure whether to gesture for him to pivot or push ahead. Karoline didn't waver. She looked as though she had been preparing for this confrontation all year. "Governor," she said, tone calm but razor sharp, "you call people like me brainwashed because it's easier than facing the consequences of your own record." She lifted a thin stack of papers from her podium, neatly printed, 3 hole punched. "But I didn't come here to trade insults. I came with facts." The audience reacted immediately, some with excitement, others with nervous anticipation. Karoline held up the documents. "These are your administration's reports," she said. "Not mine. Not Trump's. Not any conservative groups. Yours?" Newsom scoffed with forced confidence. "Karoline, please. You're parroting right-wing talking." She cut him off without even glancing in his direction. "Homelessness soared 35% under your watch. Crime rose by double digits. Businesses are leaving the state in record numbers." Each sentence hit with the precision of a gavel striking wood. "And yet," she said, "you come on national television and call me brainwashed." A low gasp swept the room. Newsom reached for his water bottle, hands trembling just slightly, not from fear, but from frustration. He wasn't used to someone younger, sharper, and unapologetically prepared standing across from him, refusing to be maneuvered into the rhetorical traps he had perfected over the years. Karoline took a single measured step forward, staying within her space but shrinking the distance between them. The cameras zoomed in immediately. "You keep telling America that California is a model for the nation," she said. "But the people actually living under your policies, the ones who fled to Florida, Texas, Tennessee, they seem to disagree. You're oversimplifying complex issues." Newsom snapped. "Then explain them," Karoline replied instantly. "Explain why California lost another major employer last month. Explain why tax revenues keep shrinking while out-migration keeps rising. Explain why the people suffering most under your policies are always the ones you claim to be helping." The moderator looked helplessly between them, unsure whether to intervene or let the explosive exchange continue. Newsom opened his mouth, but no answer came. Without his practiced talking points, he was cornered, and the entire room saw it. Karoline lifted one final page, not a statistic, but a quote. His quote. "Last year you said that anyone who criticizes California doesn't understand progress." She paused. "Well, Governor, maybe progress shouldn't require people to flee their home state." The reaction hit like a wave. Applause, shouts. A few stunned moments of silence between them. Newsom exhaled and finally spoke. "You're twisting my words." "Am I?" Karoline asked softly. Or are you just not used to someone quoting you accurately? The room froze. Camera lights burned white hot. Every phone in the audience lifted to record. Millions watching at home would replay the moment over and over, because for the first time on that debate stage, Gavin Newsom looked rattled. And Karoline Levitt, calm, collected, unflinching, looked like the only person there who came prepared to win. The lights blazed above them, and tension hung thick as static in the air. And the showdown was only getting started. The moderator sensed the shift in the room before anyone said a word. The air tightened, the audience leaned forward, and every camera in the studio seemed to swivel at the same time toward Karoline Levitt. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She sat with a calm, steady expression, like someone who had finally decided she was done playing defense. Newsom spoke first, his voice dripping with condescension. Karoline, you keep repeating talking points someone fed you. California has issues, sure, but this idea that I failed the state, that's fear-mongering. You're too young to understand leadership at scale. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Some were shocked, others irritated, but all eyes stayed locked on Karoline. She lifted her chin in a slow, deliberate motion. It was the kind of movement that told everyone she was about to flip the room onto its head. Too young, she said, her voice even and unshaken. Governor, you didn't fail California because of your age. You failed because of your decisions, and I have every one of them right here. She raised a folder, not a dramatic prop, but something real, weighty enough to matter. Documented, she continued. The rise in homelessness under your watch, the businesses that fled the state, the cost of living crisis squeezing working families while you hosted fundraisers in Napa. Documented. For the first time that night, Newsom's confident smile faltered. Karoline didn't slow down. You say I'm repeating talking points?
No, Governor, I'm repeating numbers. Your numbers.
The ones your own state auditors published. The room gasped. Phones were lifted, recording every second. Newsom leaned back, irritated but trying to maintain control. So what? You're cherry-picking. Karoline stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the quiet certainty of someone who knew she had truth on her side. Cherry-picking. Then explain this. She tapped the folder. California now ranks first in poverty, 49th in affordability, and 50th in outward migration. Those aren't cherries, Governor. That's the whole orchard on fire. The crowd erupted, cheers, shock, disbelief. The moderator tried to keep order, but the momentum was already shifting. Newsom raised a hand, trying to salvage authority. You don't understand the complexity. Complexity doesn't excuse failure. Karoline cut in, razor, sharp and calm. You called me brainwashed. But Governor, if acknowledging reality is brainwashing, then maybe you're allergic to reality. Something in Newsom froze. The moderator's eyes widened as if silently urging both sides to stay civil, but the line had already detonated. It echoed around the studio, reverberating through every camera and microphone. And for the first time that night, the governor looked rattled. The segment rolled on, and the studio lights felt almost unbearably bright. Gavin Newsom leaned back again, trying to recover the posture of a man who believed he was still winning. The audience murmured among themselves, half entertained, half exasperated. Karoline leaned forward, hands clasped, her poise unshakable. So let me get this straight, Newsom said, flashing his trademark smirk. You're young, you're passionate, but you've clearly been brainwashed by right-wing media. That's not leadership, that's indoctrination. Gasps scattered across the room. Even the camera operators paused. Karoline didn't react. She let the silence hang deliberately, letting him believe the insult had landed. Then she lifted her chin and spoke with devastating calm. Governor, if disagreeing with you means being brainwashed, then maybe the problem isn't my brain, maybe it's your record. The room broke instantly. Laughter, applause, shock. Even the moderator leaned back as if hit by the precision of the blow. You don't get to lecture me about independent thinking. Karoline continued, voice sharpening with clarity. When California is losing more families, more businesses, and more hope every single year under your watch, people aren't fleeing because they're brainwashed. They're fleeing because your leadership failed them. Newsom's smirk evaporated. Karoline leaned slightly closer, her voice soft but cutting. I wasn't brainwashed, Governor. I just paid attention. The audience exploded again, louder this time. Phones shot up. Clips were already heading for social media. The moderator attempted to regain control, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely. When Newsom tried to speak, the noise swallowed his words. The crowd wasn't on his side anymore. They were with her. Karoline didn't celebrate outwardly. She stayed composed, letting the truth settle exactly where she wanted it to land. And deep down, Newsom knew it. He had just handed her the defining moment of the debate. The lights dimmed slightly for the final segment, but the tension only thickened. Producers whispered frantically through earpieces. Analysts scribbled notes. The audience leaned forward, sensing that the next exchange could shift everything. Newsom straightened his tie, again, and launched into a monologue meant to reclaim the authority he had lost. "This is what happens," he said, pacing the edge of his podium, "when misinformation shapes young minds. People like her cling to talking points instead of reality." But by then, everyone in the room understood reality had never been on his side tonight. His smile was thin, too thin. A politician's smile stretched past its limit, held together by habit instead of confidence. Karoline didn't interrupt. She simply watched him, studying him the way someone studies a puzzle they've finally begun to solve. The silence grew thick, uncomfortable enough that even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Then, without asking permission, Karoline lifted her hand, not to speak, but to claim the room. "Governor," she began, her voice steady enough to slice through the tension like glass. "You've spent years lecturing America from a failing state, and every time someone challenges you, you hide behind buzzwords like misinformation and extremism. But receipts don't lie, your policies do." A sharp stir moved through the audience. Newsom swallowed, the sound almost visible under the bright stage lights. Karoline pulled out a single sheet of paper, not a stack, not a dramatic prop, just one damning page from his own office. "This," she said, "as a memo acknowledging that homelessness surged under your leadership, even after you spent billions on the programs you promised would fix it." She paused, letting that land. "You called me brainwashed, Governor, but your administration couldn't even keep track of where the money went." Gasps rippled across the room. Even the moderator stiffened. Newsom let out a brittle laugh, a thin attempt to regain control. "You don't understand the complexities." Karoline stepped forward before he could finish. "No. What I understand is accountability. Something you lecture others about but never practice. Something you mock people for demanding. And something California hasn't seen from you in years." The applause was immediate and deafening. Newsom froze, his polished debate mask cracking right down the middle. It was unmistakable now Karoline wasn't just responding. She was steering the moment, and everyone in the room felt it. Then she delivered the blow that shattered the segment. "You called me brainwashed. But if telling the truth makes me that, what does running from it make you?" The audience erupted. The cameras zoomed in on the governor, exposing a face suddenly stripped of its practiced confidence. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't need to. The room was smiling for her. The studio fell silent again, but it wasn't calm. It was a silence sharpened to a blade. Karoline stepped forward, the insult he had thrown at her still hanging in the air, like smoke nobody wanted to inhale. His shoulders tightened. He knew she was about to swing again, and this time he wouldn't be ready. "Governor Newsom," she said, tone precise as a scalpel, "you can call me brainwashed all you want, but the numbers from your own state say otherwise." She lifted another sheet, cameras zoomed instantly. Homelessness up 45%. Violent crime up double digits. Families fleeing the state for the first time in decades. "If I'm brainwashed, then Californians must be sprinting out of your policies." A wave of murmurs swept the crowd. Newsom tugged at his tie, an involuntary tick betraying panic. Karoline didn't pause. "You want to lecture me about critical thinking," she said. "Sir, half your state can't afford rent. You shut down small businesses while attending private dinners. And now," she let the pause build, "you're calling me brainwashed because I won't clap for your failures." The audience exploded gasps, then applause, then full cheering. Newsom leaned toward the mic to respond, but every attempt he made was swallowed by the rising roar of the room. He wasn't losing the argument anymore. He was losing the room. "Here's the truth," Karoline said, raising her voice only slightly. "If defending faith, freedom, and American families is brainwashing, then millions of us are proudly, loudly, unapologetically brainwashed. And at least we're not leaving our cities in ruins." The crowd surged. Even the camera crew exchanged bewildered looks. For the first time all night, Gavin Newsom looked genuinely rattled. Karoline stepped back, letting the wave of applause crash behind her. She had flipped the moment. She had flipped the narrative, and she had flipped him. Under the blistering lights, Karoline stood rooted and composed. The energy still crackled around her. Newsom hadn't moved. His stiff smile trembled at the corners, and producers behind the glass frantically whispered into their headsets, trying to pull the debate back from the cliff. Karoline didn't retreat to her seat. Instead, she stepped toward the center of the stage. "Governor," she said calmly, You don't get to label people brainwashed just because they disagree with your policies. That's not leadership. That's insecurity disguised as intellect. This time the applause wasn't wild, it was worse for Newsom. It was agreement. He leaned forward, trying to force composure back into his voice. You're oversimplifying complex issues. These problems aren't the result of my leadership. Every state faces structural challenges. Karoline raised an eyebrow. Funny, she replied. Most states aren't losing residents in record numbers or paying people to leave. Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. Newsom opened his mouth, but Karoline was already holding up a tablet with bite-sized charts. These aren't my opinions. These are your outcomes, she said. Homelessness up, crime up, small businesses fleeing, taxpayers running for the exit. If this is your definition of success, then thank God the rest of America doesn't share it. The moderator tried to intervene, but it was too late. Newsom's eyes dropped, realizing too late that he had lost not just the argument but control over the entire room. Karoline closed the tablet gently. If you want to call me brainwashed for caring about this country, she said softly, go ahead. But maybe ask yourself why so many Americans stopped believing you. The line struck like a hammer. Newsom inhaled sharply but couldn't form a response. The cameras caught the exact moment the narrative flipped. When the director finally cut to commercial, the applause continued long after the lights dimmed. Newsom stood, straightened his jacket and muttered, you got your moment. Don't get used to it. Karoline smiled, not smugly, but with the calm certainty of someone who understood exactly what she had done. Governor, she said, it wasn't a moment. It was clarity. And clarity, once spoken, cannot be undone.